You spend hours analyzing problems and making decisions, yet somehow you always seem to be one step behind those who appear to think faster and more strategically than you. Every day you watch colleagues and competitors anticipate moves you never saw coming, while your careful analysis leaves you reacting instead of leading, wondering if there's a secret way of thinking that successful people possess. I am Sun Tzu, the ancient strategist whose thinking methods have guided victorious leaders for over 2,500 years, and I mastered the art of strategic thinking in the deadliest arena of all, the battlefield where one wrong thought meant death. What I discovered about the hidden patterns of strategic thinking will transform how your mind processes information and anticipates outcomes, giving you the mental advantage to see opportunities and threats that others miss entirely. The same thinking secrets that won ancient wars can win modern battles in business, relationships, and life, turning you from someone who reacts to events into someone who shapes them. But first, like this video, subscribe for more ancient wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to unlock the secrets of strategic thinking. I was born into chaos. The warring states of ancient China were tearing each other apart, and every kingdom believed that brute force and larger armies would determine victory. My father served as a minor military advisor, and I grew up watching him lose battle after battle because he thought like everyone else: charge forward, strike hard, overwhelm the enemy with numbers. The moment that changed my life came when I was barely 20 years old. I witnessed a smaller force of 3,000 men completely destroy an army of 10,000, not through superior weapons or divine intervention, but through superior thinking. The victorious general had anticipated every move his opponent would make, positioned his forces where the enemy couldn't see them coming, and struck at the precise moment when his opponent was most vulnerable. It wasn't magic, it was methodology. That night, I sat by my campfire with what I now call my jade strategy scroll, frantically writing down every detail I could remember about what I had witnessed. I began to understand that warfare wasn't about who had the strongest sword or the most soldiers. It was about who could think 3 moves ahead, while their opponent was still trying to figure out the current move. I started studying not just military tactics, but human nature itself. Why did generals make predictable choices? What patterns governed how armies moved and commanders decided? I realized that most people, even intelligent ones, fell into thinking traps that made them vulnerable to those who understood these patterns. My first opportunity to test my developing theories came during a border skirmish where I was given command of a small reconnaissance unit. Instead of following conventional wisdom and engaging the enemy directly, I spent 3 days observing their movements, learning their routines, understanding their mindset. When I finally struck, it was at a time and place they never expected, using a method they couldn't counter because they hadn't even considered it possible. The victory was decisive, but more importantly, it validated my belief that thinking differently wasn't just an advantage, it was the ultimate advantage. While my opponents were playing checkers, I had learned to play chess. This is when I truly began developing what would become my life's work, a systematic approach to strategic thinking that could be learned, practiced, and mastered. I realized that the same principles that governed successful warfare could be applied to any competitive situation, any complex problem, any scenario where one person's thinking would determine the outcome. Over the following years, I refined these methods through countless campaigns, victories, and yes, occasional defeats that taught me as much as my successes. Each experience added another layer to my understanding of how the human mind could be trained to see opportunities and threats that others missed entirely. The principles I discovered weren't just theory. They were battlefield tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable, where the cost of poor thinking was measured in lives. and where only the most effective methods survived. The first and most crucial secret of strategic thinking is one that most people completely ignore. You cannot make good decisions about the external world until you understand your internal world with brutal honesty. I learned this lesson through painful experience when my own blind spots nearly cost me everything. Every morning, I would sit before my mirror of self-reflection, a polished bronze disc that served as both a practical tool and a symbolic reminder. But I wasn't just checking my appearance. I was conducting what I called my daily inventory of strengths, weaknesses, biases, and emotional states. Most generals woke up and immediately began planning attacks on their enemies. I began each day by examining my own vulnerabilities. The reason most people make poor strategic decisions isn't lack of intelligence, it's lack of self-awareness. They don't recognize their own patterns of thinking, their emotional triggers, their areas of ignorance, or their unconscious biases. They charge into complex situations armed with incomplete self-knowledge and wonder why their carefully laid plans fall apart. I developed a systematic approach to self-knowledge that I practiced religiously. First was understanding my cognitive strengths and limitations. I knew, for example, that I was exceptionally good at seeing long-term patterns but sometimes missed immediate tactical details. This knowledge allowed me to compensate by surrounding myself with advisors who excelled where I was weak. Second was emotional self-awareness. I mapped my emotional triggers, what situations made me angry, fearful, or overconfident. Anger made me want to attack directly when patience would serve better. Fear made me hesitate when decisive action was needed. Overconfidence made me underestimate opponents who deserved respect. By knowing these patterns, I could recognize when my emotions were compromising my judgment and adjust accordingly. Third was understanding my knowledge boundaries. I maintained a precise inventory of what I knew deeply, what I knew superficially, and what I didn't know at all. This prevented me from making decisions based on assumptions or filling knowledge gaps with wishful thinking. When I encountered situations beyond my expertise, I knew exactly where to seek reliable counsel. Fourth was recognizing my unconscious biases. I noticed that I tended to favor strategies that had worked for me before, even when circumstances had changed. I had a bias toward complex plans when simple ones might be more effective. I preferred advisors who thought like me rather than those who challenged my assumptions. Awareness of these tendencies allowed me to consciously counteract them. Fifth was understanding my physical and mental rhythms. I knew the times of day when my thinking was sharpest and when I was more prone to errors. I scheduled important decisions during my peak hours and avoided making critical choices when my mental energy was low. This daily practice of ruthless self-examination wasn't comfortable, but it was essential. I discovered that the leaders who failed most spectacularly were those who had the most elaborate blind spots about themselves. They built strategies on foundations of self-deception and wondered why everything collapsed. The modern application of this principle is just as crucial. Before you can outthink your competition, you must first understand your own thinking processes with complete honesty. While my opponents relied on scouts who brought back basic information about enemy positions, I built something far more sophisticated, a comprehensive intelligence network that gave me a complete picture of not just what my enemies were doing, but why they were doing it, what they would likely do next, and what vulnerabilities they didn't even know they had. My Silk intelligence map wasn't just a geographical representation, was a living document that tracked human networks, information, flows, and the subtle indicators that revealed true intentions. I understood that in any competitive situation, information is the ultimate strategic advantage, but only if you know how to gather the right information and interpret it correctly. Most people make decisions with fragments of data and call it analysis. They see immediate actions without understanding underlying motivations. They react to symptoms while remaining blind to root causes. This approach guarantees that you'll always be responding to events rather than shaping them. I developed 3 distinct types of intelligence that every strategic thinker must master. The first was tactical intelligence, immediate, actionable information about current conditions. This included obvious factors like enemy troop positions, supply levels, and recent movements. But it also included subtle indicators like the morale of enemy soldiers, the health of their horses, and the confidence level of their commanders. The second was strategic intelligence, deeper information about capabilities, intentions, and long-term plans. This required understanding not just what enemies were doing, but their overall objectives, their resource constraints, their decision-making processes, and their strategic priorities. I needed to know how they thought, not just how they acted. The third was environmental intelligence, the understanding the broader context that shaped all decisions. This included political relationships, economic pressures, seasonal factors, cultural influences, and the historical patterns that predicted future behavior. Many battles were won or lost based on factors that had nothing to do with military tactics. My intelligence network operated on multiple levels. I had obvious sources: merchants who traveled between territories, diplomats who attended formal meetings, and captured prisoners who could be questioned. But my most valuable intelligence came from less obvious sources: servants who overheard private conversations, artisans who worked on military equipment, and even children who played near military camps and noticed details that adults overlooked. Learned to distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources. By cross-referencing information and testing the accuracy of reports over time, I discovered that the most dangerous intelligence was partial truth mixed with deliberate deception, was designed to lead me toward predetermined conclusions that served my enemy's purposes. The key to effective intelligence gathering wasn't just collecting information, it was asking the right questions. Instead of asking, what is the enemy doing, I asked, what is the enemy trying to achieve? What constraints are they operating under? What assumptions are they making? And what don't they want me to know? I also understood that intelligence flows in both directions. While I was gathering information about my opponents, they were trying to gather information about me. This meant I had to carefully control what intelligence I revealed while ensuring that any deception I employed would serve my strategic objectives. The modern application of these principles is remarkable. Whether you're navigating office politics, competing in business, or making personal decisions, the same intelligence framework applies. You need tactical information about immediate conditions, strategic intelligence about long-term patterns and motivations, and environmental awareness of the broader forces that shape all outcomes. Most importantly, you must build reliable networks of information sources and develop the analytical skills to separate valuable insights from worthless noise. The ability to recognize patterns before others see them is perhaps the most powerful thinking skill I ever developed. While my enemies saw each battle as an isolated event, I understood that human behavior follows predictable patterns that repeat across time, cultures, and circumstances. My divination bones weren't tools of superstition, they were training devices. I used to sharpen my pattern recognition abilities. Most people experience events as random occurrences because they lack the framework to see the underlying structures that govern human behavior. They react to surface manifestations without recognizing the deeper currents that create those manifestations. This blindness to patterns keeps them perpetually surprised by outcomes that were actually predictable. I trained my mind to see patterns at multiple levels simultaneously. At the tactical level, I noticed that certain types of commanders always made similar decisions under pressure. Aggressive leaders became more reckless when frustrated. Cautious leaders became paralyzed when facing unexpected situations. Proud leaders could be baited into disadvantageous positions by threats to their reputation. At the strategic level, I observed that political alliances followed cyclical patterns based on shifting power balances. Economic pressures created predictable military behaviors. Seasonal changes affected not just logistics, but also the psychological state of armies. Cultural values influenced decision-making in ways that were consistent across different situations. At the philosophical level, I recognized that human nature itself contains patterns that transcend individual personalities. People seek security, recognition, and meaning in predictable ways. They respond to fear, opportunity, and uncertainty according to patterns that can be studied and anticipated. The key to developing pattern recognition was learning to observe without immediately judging or reacting. Most people see an event and immediately categorize it as good or bad, threatening or beneficial. This emotional reaction prevents them from seeing the event clearly as part of a larger pattern. I trained myself to observe first, analyze second, and react third. I also learned to look for patterns across different domains. Military patterns often mirrored political patterns. Economic cycles influenced social behaviors. Individual psychology reflected broader cultural patterns. By studying these connections, I could predict developments in one area by observing changes in another. One of my most effective pattern recognition techniques was what I called historical mapping. I studied similar situations from the past and identified the factors that led to different outcomes. When I encountered new situations, I could quickly identify which historical patterns they most closely resembled and adjust my strategy accordingly. I discovered that most patterns have what I called inflection points moments, when small changes could redirect the entire pattern toward a different outcome. Recognizing these inflection points allowed me to intervene at precisely the right moment, with precisely the right action to achieve dramatically different results. Pattern recognition also taught me to distinguish between coincidence and causation. Just because two events occurred together didn't mean one caused the other. Real patterns had underlying mechanisms that created consistent relationships between causes and effects. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that patterns exist at different timescales. Some patterns play out over days or weeks. Others unfold over months or years. The most powerful strategic insights came from recognizing long-term patterns that others missed because they were focused on short-term fluctuations. In today's world, the same pattern recognition principles apply whether you're analyzing market trends, predicting competitor behavior, or understanding social dynamics. The human brain is naturally wired to see patterns, but most people never develop this capacity. Systematically, they see isolated events instead of connected systems, random occurrences instead of predictable cycles, and surface symptoms instead of underlying structures. The strategic thinker learns to see the patterns that others miss, and more importantly, learns to position themselves advantageously within those patterns before they become obvious to everyone else. In the heat of battle, there is no time for lengthy deliberation. The commander who can assess a situation accurately in moments while his opponent spends precious minutes analyzing will win before the fighting even begins. This is why I developed what I carried on my lightning decision tablet, a systematic approach to rapid assessment that allowed me to make consistently good decisions under extreme time pressure. Most people believe that quick decisions are necessarily poor decisions, but this reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of how strategic thinking works. The goal isn't to think faster, it's to think more efficiently by having the right frameworks already in place when rapid decisions are required. I discovered that decision paralysis comes from trying to analyze too many variables simultaneously without a clear prioritization system. When faced with complex situations, Most people attempt to consider every possible factor and outcome, which overwhelms their cognitive capacity and leads to delayed, often poor decisions. My approach was different. I trained myself to instantly identify the three most critical factors in any situation and focus my rapid assessment on those elements while temporarily ignoring less important variables. This wasn't about being reckless, which was about being strategically selective. Under time pressure, the first element I always assessed was the immediate threat level. What was the worst thing that could happen if I delayed my decision? How much time did I actually have before the situation deteriorated beyond recovery? This prevented me from rushing decisions that didn't require speed while ensuring I acted quickly when delay was dangerous. The second element was opportunity cost. What was I giving up by choosing one option over another? In rapid assessment, I couldn't evaluate every possible alternative, but I could quickly identify the most promising options and compare their relative advantages. This prevented me from seizing the first available option when better alternatives existed. The third element was reversibility. Could this decision be changed if new information emerged? Decisions that were easily reversible required less analysis than those that would lock me into a particular course of action. Understanding this distinction allowed me to move quickly on reversible decisions while taking more time on irreversible ones. I also developed what I called decision shortcuts, mental frameworks that allowed me to bypass lengthy analysis in common situations. For example, I knew that in situations where I had superior information, aggressive action was usually correct. When facing uncertain conditions, conservative positioning was typically wise. When dealing with predictable opponents, unconventional approaches often succeeded. These shortcuts weren't rigid rules. They were starting points that allowed me to reach good decisions quickly while remaining flexible enough to adjust when circumstances were unusual. The key was having these frameworks so well practiced that applying them became automatic. Training my rapid assessment skills required constant practice in low-stakes situations. I would deliberately put myself in scenarios where I had to make quick decisions and then analyze the outcomes to refine my process. Over time, I developed an intuitive sense of when to trust my rapid assessment and when the situation required deeper analysis. I learned that the most dangerous moment in rapid decision-making was when I felt pressured to choose between two equally attractive options. This usually meant I hadn't properly understood the situation and needed to reframe the problem rather than simply choosing quickly between inadequate alternatives. In modern contexts, these same principles apply whether you're responding to a business crisis, navigating social situations, or making personal decisions under pressure. The strategic thinker develops reliable frameworks for rapid assessment, while maintaining the wisdom to recognize when quick decisions are inappropriate and deeper analysis is required. The most profound strategic advantage comes not from understanding your own mind, but from understanding your opponent's mind so completely that you can predict their decisions before they make them. My mask of many faces wasn't just a collection of disguises. It represented my systematic study of different psychological archetypes and the thinking patterns that governed each type of adversary I might face. Most people approach competitive situations by focusing on their own strengths and strategies, but this approach guarantees that you'll be constantly surprised by your opponent's moves. The strategic thinker learns to think like their opponent, not to become like them, but to anticipate their decisions and position themselves advantageously. I developed this capability through years of careful observation and practice. I would study enemy commanders not just to understand their tactics, but to understand their underlying psychology, their fears, ambitions, blind spots, and decision-making patterns. I learned that most people are remarkably predictable once you understand the mental frameworks they use to interpret situations. The first step in opponent analysis was identifying their dominant psychological type. Some leaders were driven primarily by pride and would make decisions to protect their reputation, even when those decisions were strategically unsound. Others were motivated by fear and would consistently choose overly conservative options that missed opportunities for decisive advantage. Still others were dominated by greed and could be manipulated through apparent opportunities for gain. Understanding these psychological drivers allowed me to predict not just what my opponents would do, but when they would do it and why. A pride-driven commander would inevitably respond to perceived insults with aggressive action, often at tactically disadvantageous moments. A fear-driven leader would hesitate at crucial moments, creating opportunities for swift action. A greed-motivated opponent would pursue attractive targets even when those targets were obviously traps. The second step was understanding their information processing patterns. How did they gather intelligence? What sources did they trust? What types of information did they ignore or dismiss? By understanding how my opponents made sense of the world, I could influence what information they received and how they interpreted it. Some commanders relied heavily on formal reports and dismissed information that came through informal channels. Others trusted their personal observations but were skeptical of second-hand intelligence. Understanding these preferences allowed me to shape their perception of situations by controlling which types of information reached them through which channels. The third step was analyzing their strategic preferences and habitual responses. Most leaders fell into predictable patterns when facing familiar situations. They had preferred tactical approaches, typical responses to pressure, and standard methods for dealing with uncertainty. These patterns became their vulnerabilities. Because I could design strategies that exploited their predictable responses, I also learned to identify what I called cognitive blind spots, areas where opponents consistently failed to see important information or consider crucial possibilities. Some leaders were excellent at managing logistics, but poor at reading political dynamics. Others understood tactics brilliantly, but missed strategic implications. By operating in their blind spots, I could achieve objectives they never saw coming. Perhaps most importantly, I studied how different types of opponents responded to deception itself. Some were naturally suspicious and would question any information that seemed too convenient. Others were trusting by nature and would accept deceptive information at face value. Still others were so confident in their analytical abilities that they would construct elaborate theories to explain away information that contradicted their preconceptions. This understanding allowed me to tailor my deceptive strategies to each opponent's psychological profile. For suspicious opponents, I would embed true information within false information to build credibility before delivering the crucial deception. For trusting opponents, I could employ more direct, deceptive approaches. For overconfident opponents, I would provide information that supported their existing beliefs while leading them toward incorrect conclusions. The key insight was that successful deception isn't about fooling people, it's about understanding how they fool themselves, and then providing them with information that supports their natural tendency towards self-deception. Strategic thinking is mentally exhausting, and most people fail not because they lack intelligence, but because they exhaust their cognitive resources on unimportant decisions and have nothing left when crucial moments arrive. My energy conservation compass taught me to treat mental energy as my most precious resource, one that must be carefully allocated and strategically preserved. I learned this lesson during a prolonged campaign where I was making dozens of decisions daily, from minor logistical matters to major strategic choices. Initially, I applied the same level of mental effort to every decision, believing that thoroughness was always superior to efficiency. By the campaign's midpoint, I was mentally depleted and began making critical errors that nearly cost me everything. This experience taught me that the human mind has limited cognitive capacity and strategic thinkers must learn to allocate this capacity wisely. Not every decision deserves deep analysis. Not every problem requires creative thinking. Not every situation demands peak mental performance. The art lies in recognizing which moments truly matter and conserving energy for those crucial decisions. I developed a systematic approach to mental energy management based on decision categorization. Routine decisions that I had made many times before could be handled automatically using established protocols. These included standard military procedures, basic administrative tasks, and common tactical situations where proven approaches existed. Important but non-urgent decisions could be delegated to trusted subordinates or postponed until my mental energy was restored. These included planning future campaigns, evaluating personnel changes, and analyzing intelligence that didn't require immediate action. By batching these decisions and handling them during high-energy periods, I could maintain quality while preserving cognitive resources. Critical decisions that would determine the outcome of campaigns received my full mental attention during peak cognitive hours. I learned to identify my daily patterns of mental energy and scheduled the most important thinking work during periods when my mind was sharpest and most creative. I also discovered the importance of mental recovery practices. Just as physical muscles need rest after intense exertion, the mind requires periods of recovery after demanding cognitive work. I developed routines that allowed my brain to restore its capacity. Meditation, physical exercise, engaging in activities that required different types of thinking, and ensuring adequate sleep. Perhaps most importantly, I learned to recognize the early signs of mental fatigue before it compromised my decision. When I noticed decreased concentration, increased irritability, or a tendency to avoid difficult decisions, I knew it was time to step back and restore my cognitive capacity rather than pushing through and making potentially costly errors. I distinguished between two types of thinking that required different energy levels. Analytical thinking, breaking down complex problems into components, evaluating alternatives, and following logical sequences, was mentally demanding and required full cognitive resources. Intuitive thinking, pattern recognition, quick assessments, and decisions based on experience was less exhausting and could be sustained for longer periods. Understanding this distinction allowed me to alternate between analytical and intuitive modes depending on the situation and my energy level. When mentally fresh, I could tackle complex analytical problems. When cognitively fatigued, I could still rely on intuitive patterns developed through years of experience. The strategic thinker learns to manage mental energy like a finite resource, investing it where it will have the greatest impact while developing efficient approaches for routine decisions. This isn't about being lazy, it's about being strategically selective with your most valuable asset, your cognitive capacity. A perfect strategy executed at the wrong time will fail, while an imperfect strategy executed at the perfect moment can achieve miraculous results. This is why I spent years studying what I recorded in my seasonal war calendar, the natural rhythms that govern when different types of actions are most likely to succeed. Most people focus entirely on what to do while ignoring the equally important question of when to do it. They develop brilliant plans and wonder why they fail, never recognizing that timing was the missing element that would have transformed failure into victory. I discovered that timing operates at multiple levels simultaneously. At the macro level, there are seasonal patterns that affect everything from military logistics to political alliances. Spring brings energy and optimism that favors aggressive action. Summer provides maximum resources and operational capacity. Autumn creates urgency as people prepare for winter's constraints. Winter forces consolidation and careful resource management. At the micro level, there are daily and weekly rhythms that influence decision-making and performance. People think differently at different times of day. They respond to proposals differently, depending on what they've recently experienced. They're more receptive to certain types of messages at some moments than others. Understanding these rhythms allowed me to time my actions for maximum effectiveness. I scheduled difficult negotiations when opponents were most likely to be receptive. I launched attacks when enemy alertness was naturally low. I made important announcements when the audience was most prepared to receive them positively. But timing isn't just about reading natural rhythms. It's also about creating the right moment through preparation and positioning. The strategic thinker doesn't just wait for favorable conditions. They work systematically to create favorable conditions while remaining ready to act when the moment arrives. I learned to distinguish between patience and procrastination. Patience meant waiting for the right moment while actively preparing for that moment. Procrastination meant delaying action due to fear, uncertainty, or hope that conditions would improve without effort. The patient strategist uses waiting time productively. The procrastinator simply waits. Creating the right moment often required careful sequencing of preliminary actions. Before launching a major offensive, I would spend weeks or months positioning forces, gathering intelligence, building alliances, and shaping the battlefield. When I finally acted, success appeared sudden to observers, but it was actually the culmination of extensive preparation. I also discovered the importance of recognizing fleeting opportunities that couldn't be predicted, but had to be seized immediately when they appeared. These moments required different skills: the ability to quickly assess whether an unexpected opportunity was genuine, the decisiveness to act without complete information, and the flexibility to abandon planned actions when better alternatives emerged. The art of timing also involved understanding momentum and knowing when to accelerate, maintain, or change direction. Success often came from recognizing when small actions could create large results because conditions were primed for change. Failure often resulted from applying force when conditions resisted change, or from missing the moment when transformation was possible. Perhaps most critically, I learned to read the timing signals that indicated when opponents were most vulnerable to specific types of pressure. Pride-driven leaders were most vulnerable after public setbacks. Fear-driven leaders were most susceptible during periods of uncertainty. Greed-motivated opponents were easiest to manipulate when they were experiencing resource constraints. In modern contexts, these same timing principles apply whether you're launching a business initiative, making a career move, or navigating personal relationships. The strategic thinker learns to read the rhythms that govern their environment, while actively working to create the conditions that will make their actions most effective when the right moment arrives. The greatest victories come not from overpowering opponents directly, but from achieving your objectives through paths they never anticipated and cannot effectively defend against. This principle, which I contemplated daily while holding my water stone, taught me that the most elegant solutions often involve changing the nature of the problem rather than attacking it head-on. Most people approach obstacles with brute force, believing that harder effort will overcome resistance. They see a wall and try to break through it, rather than finding a way around, over, or under it. This direct approach sometimes works, but it's expensive, exhausting, and often unnecessary when more elegant alternatives exist. I learned the power of indirect thinking during a siege where the enemy fortress appeared impregnable. Direct assault would have cost thousands of lives, with uncertain results. Instead, I studied the situation until I identified what the defenders truly needed to maintain their position: not just food and water, but morale, communication with allies, and confidence in their leadership. Rather than attacking the walls, I systematically undermined these foundations. I intercepted their communications and replaced them with messages suggesting their allies had abandoned them. I arranged for apparent defectors to spread stories about dissension among their leaders, I demonstrated my force's strength in ways that made continued resistance seem hopeless rather than heroic. Within weeks, the fortress surrendered without a single direct assault. I had achieved my objective completely while conserving my resources and maintaining my army's strength for future campaigns. This experience taught me that the supreme excellence in strategic thinking is achieving your goals while making direct confrontation unnecessary. The indirect approach requires a fundamental shift in how you frame problems. Instead of asking, "How can I defeat this obstacle?" the strategic thinker asks, "How can I make this obstacle irrelevant?" Instead of seeking to overpower resistance, you seek to make resistance serve your purposes or simply flow around it. This approach works because most people and organizations prepare defenses against obvious, direct attacks while leaving indirect approaches unguarded. They anticipate frontal assaults but miss flanking maneuvers. They defend against external threats but remain vulnerable to internal contradictions. They protect their strengths while ignoring how their weaknesses can be exploited. I developed several categories of indirect strategy. The first was changing the rules of engagement. When opponents expected military confrontation, I would shift to political maneuvering. When they prepared for open conflict, I would employ economic pressure. When they anticipated aggression, I would use diplomatic solutions that achieved my objectives through agreement rather than conquest. The second was attacking the support system rather than the primary target. Instead of confronting enemy armies directly, I would disrupt their supply lines, undermine their alliances, or create internal conflicts that force them to divide their attention. By weakening the foundation, I could topple structures that would have been impregnable if attacked directly. The third was using opponents' strengths against them. Aggressive enemies could be baited into overextending themselves. Defensive opponents could be maneuvered into positions where their caution became a liability. Prideful leaders could be manipulated into making decisions that served my purposes, while flattering their egos. The fourth was redefining victory itself. Sometimes the best way to win a contest was to change what winning meant. By shifting the criteria for success, I could achieve meaningful objectives while allowing opponents to claim symbolic victories that satisfied their need for recognition without threatening my substantial interests. The indirect approach requires patience, creativity, and the wisdom to recognize when direct action is actually necessary. Not every situation calls for indirect solutions. Sometimes the shortest distance between 2 points really is a straight line. The art lies in recognizing which approach each situation demands, and having the flexibility to employ either as circumstances dictate. In modern contexts, these principles apply whether you're resolving workplace conflicts, competing in business, or pursuing personal goals. The strategic thinker always considers whether there might be an elegant, indirect path to their objective before committing to the obvious, direct approach. The most brilliant strategic thinking becomes worthless if it cannot be translated into effective action, and the most decisive action becomes destructive if it isn't guided by clear strategic thought. This is why I carried my unified command seal as a constant reminder that thinking and action must be seamlessly integrated, not treated as separate phases of strategy. I learned this lesson painfully during an early campaign, where I developed what I believed was a perfect strategy. I had analyzed every variable, anticipated every contingency, and created detailed plans that addressed every possible scenario. Yet when the time came for execution, everything fell apart because I had failed to ensure that my strategic thinking could be translated into practical action by real people under real conditions. The problem wasn't with my thinking. It was with the gap between thinking and doing. I had created a strategy that existed only in my mind, without considering the practical challenges of communication, coordination, and implementation that would determine whether my ideas could actually work in the chaos of battle. This experience taught me that strategic thinking must always include implementation thinking. It's not enough to know what should be done, you must understand how it can be done, who will do it, when they will do it, and what obstacles they will face in the process. The strategist who ignores these practical realities creates elegant theories that collapse when they encounter the mesinzas of actual execution. I developed what I called the seamless approach to strategy, where thinking and action were designed together from the beginning rather than treated as sequential stages. When developing strategic objectives, I simultaneously considered the practical steps required to achieve those objectives. When analyzing options, I evaluated not just their theoretical merit, but their implementability under real-world conditions. This approach required understanding the capabilities and limitations of the people who would execute my strategies. Different commanders had different strengths. Some excelled at complex maneuvers while others were better suited for straightforward approaches. Some units were highly disciplined and could execute precise plans, while others were more effective when given general objectives and allowed to improvise tactics. Matching strategic thinking to execution capabilities meant designing strategies that leveraged available strengths rather than requiring capabilities that didn't exist. A perfect strategy that exceeded my force's ability to execute was inferior to a simpler strategy that could be implemented effectively. I also learned the importance of maintaining strategic focus during the chaos of implementation. Battle conditions change rapidly, unexpected obstacles emerge, and original plans often require modification. The key was distinguishing between tactical adjustments that served strategic objectives and random reactions that undermined them. This required what I called strategic anchoring, identifying the core principles and objectives that must remain constant even when specific tactics had to change. My subordinates understood these anchoring principles so they could make tactical adjustments without losing strategic direction when circumstances required improvisation. Communication played a crucial role in maintaining unity between thought and action. Strategic thinking is useless if it cannot be communicated clearly to the people responsible for execution. I developed simple, memorable ways to express complex strategic concepts so that every level of command understood not just what to do, but why they were doing it and how their actions contributed to larger objectives. I learned to build feedback loops that allowed execution experiences to inform strategic thinking. When tactics succeeded or failed, I analyzed why and incorporated those lessons into future strategic planning. This created a continuous improvement cycle where thinking and action refined each other over time. Perhaps most importantly, I understood that strategic thinking must continue during action, not just before it. Battles are dynamic and effective. Strategy requires constant adjustment based on real-time information. The strategist who stops thinking once action begins will quickly find their plans obsolete and their forces vulnerable. In modern contexts, these same principles apply whether you're implementing business strategies, managing projects, or pursuing personal goals. The gap between planning and execution destroys more good ideas than poor planning ever could. Rigid thinking is the enemy of strategic success, and the strategist who cannot adapt their approach when circumstances change will find their best plans becoming their greatest vulnerabilities. This is why I always carried my bamboo staff, a weapon that derived its power not from hardness, but from flexibility that allowed it to bend without breaking and strike from unexpected angles. I discovered the importance of cognitive flexibility during a campaign where my initial strategy was proceeding perfectly until the political situation shifted dramatically. An unexpected alliance formed between two enemy states, completely changing the strategic landscape. My original plan, which had been brilliant under the previous conditions, was now leading me toward certain defeat. Many commanders in such situations become trapped by their previous thinking. they continue pursuing strategies that no longer match reality because admitting the need for change feels like admitting failure. They escalate commitment to failing approaches rather than acknowledging that changed circumstances require changed strategies. I learned to view adaptability not as a weakness, but as a fundamental strength. The ability to change course when conditions change is what separates successful strategists from stubborn ones. Flexibility isn't about abandoning principles, it's about finding new ways to achieve enduring objectives when original methods become obsolete. Developing cognitive flexibility required training myself to hold strategies lightly rather than treating them as sacred commitments. I approached each plan as a hypothesis to be tested against reality rather than a truth to be defended. This mindset made it easier to modify or abandon approaches when evidence suggested they were no longer optimal. I also practiced scenario planning that prepared me mentally for various possible changes. By thinking through different ways situations might evolve, I developed contingency frameworks that allowed rapid adaptation when circumstances shifted. Instead of being surprised by change, I was prepared for it. The key to effective flexibility was maintaining clarity about core objectives while remaining open to different methods of achieving those objectives. My fundamental goals remained constant, but my strategies for reaching those goals evolved as conditions changed. This distinction prevented flexibility from becoming aimless wandering without direction. I learned to recognize the signals that indicated when strategic adaptation was necessary. These included changes in enemy behavior patterns, shifts in resource availability, new information that contradicted previous assumptions, and feedback indicating that current approaches weren't producing expected results. Equally important was knowing when to persist, despite apparent setbacks. Not every obstacle required a complete change of strategies. Sometimes temporary difficulties were part of the normal process of achieving long-term objectives. The art lay in distinguishing between situations that called for persistence and those that demanded adaptation. Flexibility also meant being willing to learn from opponents and incorporate their successful innovations into my own approach. Pride often prevents leaders from adopting ideas that originated with enemies, but the strategic thinker recognizes that good ideas have value regardless of their source. I developed what I called structured improvisation, the ability to adapt tactics spontaneously while maintaining strategic coherence. This required deep understanding of underlying principles so that surface changes didn't compromise fundamental objectives. Like skilled musicians who can improvise while staying within harmonic structures, flexible strategists can adapt methods while preserving strategic logic. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that flexibility requires emotional discipline. Change often involves admitting mistakes, abandoning investments of time and resources, and accepting uncertainty about outcomes. The strategist who cannot manage these emotional challenges will resist necessary adaptations until circumstances force much more painful adjustments. In today's rapidly changing environment, cognitive flexibility is more crucial than ever. Whether you're navigating career transitions, adapting to technological changes, or responding to competitive pressures, the ability to evolve your approach while maintaining your core objectives determines whether change becomes opportunity or crisis. True strategic advantage comes not from winning immediate battles, but from positioning yourself to win the war that unfolds over years or even decades. This long-term perspective, which I documented in my generational scroll, required a type of thinking that most people find almost impossible: the ability to sacrifice short-term gains for long-term positioning, while maintaining the patience to see strategies unfold over extended time periods. Learn the power of strategic patience during a conflict where I could have achieved immediate victory through direct assault. but recognized that such a victory would create long-term problems that would ultimately cost me more than I gained. Instead, I chose a slower approach that took months longer but left me in a far stronger position for future challenges. Most people struggle with long-term thinking because the human mind is naturally biased toward immediate rewards and visible progress. They want strategies that produce quick results and become frustrated when meaningful change takes time to manifest. This impatience leads them to abandon effective long-term strategies in favor of less effective approaches that provide immediate gratification. Strategic patience requires a fundamental shift in how you measure progress and define success. Instead of focusing only on immediate outcomes, you must learn to recognize the subtle indicators that show whether long-term strategies are working even when visible results haven't yet appeared. Develops what I called the multiple horizons approach to strategic thinking. At the immediate horizon, I focused on actions that would produce results within days or weeks. At the intermediate horizon, I planned initiatives that would unfold over months or seasons. At the extended horizon, I positioned myself for advantages that might not materialize for years, but would be decisive when they did. This approach required carefully balancing immediate needs with long-term positioning. I couldn't ignore short-term pressures in favor of long-term plans, but I also couldn't let immediate demands completely drive my strategic choices. The art was finding ways to address present challenges while simultaneously building foundation for future advantages. Long-term thinking also meant understanding how current actions would compound over time. Small advantages accumulated through consistent application of strategic principles could eventually become insurmountable leads. Conversely, minor compromises that seemed insignificant in isolation could accumulate into major vulnerabilities. If repeated consistently, I learned to identify what I called strategic inflection points, moments when relatively small actions could set in motion long-term trends that would determine outcomes years later. These moments often appeared unremarkable at the time, but the strategist who recognized and acted on them could shape future conditions in their favor. Strategic patience required emotional discipline because long-term strategies often looked like mistakes in the short term. While competitors celebrated immediate victories, I was sometimes consolidating positions that wouldn't pay off for months. While others pursued obvious opportunities, I was sometimes building capabilities that had no immediate application but would become crucial later. This patient approach also meant accepting that some of my strategies would take longer to succeed than I initially expected. Complex systems change slowly, and meaningful transformations often required multiple attempts before achieving breakthrough results. The key was distinguishing between strategies that were working slowly and strategies that weren't working at all. I also understood that strategic patience didn't mean passive waiting. True patience was active, constantly building, positioning, and preparing for the moment when long-term strategies would come to fruition. This required maintaining high levels of activity and engagement while accepting that visible results might be delayed. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that long-term strategic success often required making decisions that were unpopular or misunderstood in the short term. The strategic thinker must have the conviction to pursue approaches that others consider too slow, too complex, or too uncertain when those approaches serve enduring objectives. In modern contexts, this same patient perspective is essential whether you're building a career, developing expertise, or creating sustainable competitive advantages. The strategies that produce lasting success often require years of consistent application before their full power becomes apparent. The most crucial information is often communicated through what people don't say, rather than what they do say. And the strategic thinker who can read these silent messages gains access to insights that remain hidden from those who only listen to words. This skill, which I developed through countless hours of observation, while wearing my silent observer's cloak, allowed me to understand true intentions, hidden fears, and secret plans that my opponents never intended to reveal. I discovered this principle during negotiations with a rival commander who spoke eloquently about his desire for peace, while his body language, timing, and subtle word choices revealed his actual intention to attack as soon as he could gain a temporary advantage. His words said one thing, but everything else about his behavior communicated something entirely different. Most people focus exclusively on verbal communication and miss the vast amount of information transmitted through nonverbal channels. They hear the official message but remain blind to the emotional undercurrents, hidden agendas, and unspoken assumptions that often matter more than explicit statements. Learning to read unspoken communication required training myself to observe multiple layers of information simultaneously. The first layer was body language, posture, gestures, facial expressions, and physical positioning that revealed emotional states and true attitudes. Confident leaders moved differently than fearful ones. Honest negotiators displayed different physical patterns than deceptive ones. The second layer was vocal patterns beyond actual words' tone, pace, emphasis, and timing that indicated whether speakers believed what they were saying and how they felt about their message. Uncertainty, deception, and hidden emotions all created distinctive vocal signatures that could be detected with careful attention. The third layer was behavioral patterns, what people chose to do when they chose to do it, and how those choices related to their stated intentions. Actions often revealed priorities and motivations that contradicted verbal claims. The timing of decisions, the allocation of resources, and the selection of advisors all communicated strategic information. The fourth layer was what I called contextual communication, understanding what wasn't being discussed, which topics were avoided, and what questions weren't being asked. Sometimes the most important information was revealed by the subjects that people carefully avoided mentioning. I developed specific techniques for reading different types of unspoken communication. When assessing truthfulness, I looked for inconsistencies between verbal claims and behavioral evidence. When evaluating confidence levels, I observed how people positioned themselves physically and how they responded to unexpected questions. When analyzing hidden agendas, I studied which topics generated emotional reactions and which suggestions were dismissed too quickly. I also learned to read group dynamics and understand how individual behavior changed in different social contexts. People often revealed their true feelings about leaders through subtle signs of deference or resistance. Alliance patterns could be detected through who spoke first, who looked at whom before responding, and how physical space was negotiated during meetings. Perhaps most importantly, I understood that reading unspoken communication required managing my own emotional reactions to avoid projecting my expectations onto ambiguous signals. It was easy to see what I wanted to see or interpret neutral behaviors as confirming my existing beliefs about people's motivations. I developed verification methods to test my interpretations of unspoken communication. I would look for multiple indicators that supported the same conclusion rather than relying on single observations. I would create small tests to see whether people's unspoken communication patterns remained consistent across different situations. This skill also required understanding cultural and individual differences in nonverbal communication. What indicated deception in one culture might be normal behavior in another. What suggested confidence in one personality type might indicate anxiety in another. Accurate reading required adapting interpretation frameworks to specific contexts and individuals. The strategic advantage of reading unspoken communication was enormous. I could detect deception before it succeeded, identify hidden alliances before they were announced, and recognize emerging opportunities or threats before they became obvious to everyone else. This advanced knowledge allowed me to position myself advantageously while others remained unaware of changing dynamics. In modern contexts, these same skills are invaluable, whether you're negotiating business deals, navigating workplace politics, or building personal relationships. The ability to read what people really mean, not just what they say, provides strategic insights that can transform your effectiveness in any competitive or collaborative situation. Your mind is under constant attack from forces trying to influence your thinking, cloud your judgment, and manipulate your decisions. And the strategist who cannot defend their mental processes will find their best thinking corrupted by external influences designed to serve others' interests. This is why I created my Mind Fortress, modular systematic approach to protecting the integrity of strategic thought against psychological warfare, emotional manipulation, and cognitive subversion. I learned the reality of mental warfare during a campaign where an enemy commander nearly defeated me without ever engaging my army directly. Instead, he launched a sophisticated attack on my thinking processes, feeding me carefully crafted false information, exploiting my psychological biases, and creating emotional pressure designed to force poor decisions. I realized that the most important battle was happening inside my own mind. Most people remain completely unaware that their thinking is being influenced by external forces. They believe their opinions, preferences, and decisions emerge from their own independent analysis, never recognizing how their mental processes have been shaped by propaganda, social pressure, emotional manipulation, and cognitive exploitation. Techniques that operate below the level of conscious awareness. The first line of mental defense was understanding my own cognitive vulnerabilities. Everyone has psychological weak points that can be exploited, emotional triggers, logical blind spots, confirmation biases, and decision-making patterns that become predictable under pressure. Self-awareness of these vulnerabilities was essential. For recognizing when they were being targeted, I identified several categories of mental attack that required different defensive strategies. Information warfare involved flooding me with false or misleading data designed to corrupt my understanding of situations. The defense was developing reliable information, verification methods, and maintaining skepticism about convenient intelligence that supported my existing beliefs. Emotional manipulation attempted to trigger fear, anger, pride, or greed that would override rational analysis. Recognizing emotional manipulation required monitoring my own emotional states and questioning decisions made during periods of intense feeling. When I noticed my emotions driving my thinking, I would delay important decisions until I could analyze situations more objectively. Social pressure tactics tried to isolate me from advisors, create artificial urgency for decisions, or make me feel that opposing certain courses of action would damage my reputation. The defense was maintaining independent counsel and resisting any pressure to make important decisions quickly without proper analysis. Cognitive exploitation targeted the mental shortcuts and unconscious patterns I use to process information efficiently. Skilled manipulators could present information in ways that triggered automatic responses while bypassing critical thinking. Protection required slowing down decision-making processes for important choices and deliberately engaging analytical thinking even when intuitive responses seemed obvious. I developed daily practices for maintaining mental clarity and resistance to manipulation. These included regular periods of solitary reflection away from external influences, consultation with trusted advisors who were encouraged to challenge my assumptions, and systematic review of recent decisions to identify any patterns that might indicate compromised thinking. Perhaps most importantly, I learned to recognize the signs that my mental defenses had been penetrated. These included making decisions that contradicted my established principles without clear justification, feeling unusual certainty about complex situations that should have generated uncertainty, and experiencing emotional reactions that seemed disproportionate to actual circumstances. I also understood that mental defense required active rather than passive strategies. Instead of just trying to filter out harmful influences, I proactively sought out information and perspectives that would challenge my thinking and expose any blind spots that enemies might exploit. By stress testing my ideas against opposing viewpoints, I could identify weaknesses before opponents discovered them. The strategic thinker must also recognize that mental warfare operates at collective as well as individual levels. Groups, organizations, and entire populations can have their thinking processes corrupted through systematic influence campaigns. Understanding these larger patterns helped me recognize when individual psychological pressure was part of broader strategic manipulation. In today's information-rich environment, these mental defense skills are more crucial than ever. Whether you're facing workplace politics, media manipulation, or social pressure, the ability to maintain clear thinking under psychological attack determines whether you'll make decisions that serve your interests or someone else's agenda. The mind that cannot defend itself becomes a weapon in the hands of those who understand how to wield it. The most powerful innovations often emerge not from unlimited resources, but from the creative pressure of working within strict limitations that force you to find entirely new approaches to old problems. This paradox, which I explored through my bound creativity boxer puzzle that could only be solved by working within seemingly impossible constraints, taught me that restrictions often enhance rather than hinder strategic thinking by forcing breakthrough insights that would never emerge in unconstrained environments. I discovered this principle during a campaign where I faced an enemy with superior numbers, better equipment, and more favorable terrain. Every conventional approach led to certain defeat, but these very limitations forced me to think beyond traditional military tactics and develop innovative strategies that turned my disadvantages into unexpected advantages. Most people view constraints as obstacles to creativity and innovation, believing that freedom from limitations will automatically produce better solutions. This perspective misunderstands how creative thinking actually works. Unlimited options can paralyze decision-making and lead to conventional solutions, while carefully chosen constraints can focus creative energy and force innovative approaches that wouldn't be discovered otherwise. The key to innovation within constraints was learning to reframe limitations as design parameters rather than obstacles. Instead of asking, "How can I overcome these restrictions?" I learned to ask, "How can I achieve my objectives while working within these specific boundaries?" This shift in perspective transformed constraints from problems to be eliminated into creative challenges to be solved. I developed several approaches to constraint-driven innovation. The first was resource optimization, finding ways to achieve maximum impact with minimum resources by identifying the produced essential elements that produced desired outcomes and eliminating everything else. This forced me to understand problems at their most fundamental level. The second approach was constraint inversion, deliberately seeking ways to make limitations work in my favor rather than against me. Small armies could move faster than large ones. Limited supplies forced innovation in logistics. Unfavorable terrain could be used to channel enemy movements into disadvantageous positions. The third approach was boundary expansion, looking for ways to operate outside the apparent constraints by redefining the problem or changing the rules of engagement. When direct military action was impossible, political maneuvering might achieve the same objectives. When conventional tactics were inadequate, unconventional approaches could succeed. I learned that effective innovation required understanding which constraints were real and which were assumed. Many limitations that seemed absolute were actually self-imposed boundaries based on conventional thinking. By questioning these assumptions, I could often find ways to operate that others hadn't considered possible. The creative process within constraints also required developing comfort with ambiguity and incomplete solutions. When working within strict limitations, perfect solutions rarely existed, but innovative combinations of imperfect elements could produce results that exceeded what perfect solutions might have achieved in unconstrained environments. I discovered that constraints could actually accelerate innovation by eliminating analysis paralysis and forcing rapid experimentation. When resources were limited, I couldn't afford to spend excessive time on theoretical planning and had to test ideas quickly through small-scale experiments that revealed what worked and what didn't. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that innovation required a fundamentally different mindset about failure. When working within severe limitations, most attempted solutions would fail, but each failure provided valuable information about the boundaries of possibility and pointed toward approaches that might succeed. The strategic thinker learns to view constraints not as barriers to success, but as focusing mechanisms that concentrate creative energy on finding breakthrough solutions. Some of history's greatest innovations emerged from severe resource limitations that forced inventors to find entirely new approaches to fundamental problems. In modern contexts, these same principles apply whether you're launching a startup with limited capital, solving complex problems with restricted resources, or finding creative solutions within organizational constraints. The discipline of innovation within limitations often produces more elegant and sustainable solutions than unlimited resources ever could. True creative power emerges not from having everything you want, but from making the most of what you have, while working within the boundaries that force you to think differently. Strategic mastery comes not from excelling at individual thinking techniques, but from integrating all these elements into a unified approach that operates as naturally as breathing and as powerfully as a force of nature. This synthesis, which I represented through my synthesis crystallia, multifaceted gem that reflected light differently depending on the angle of observation, transforms isolated skills into a comprehensive thinking system that becomes greater than the sum of its parts. After years of developing and refining individual strategic thinking capabilities, I reached a point where these separate techniques began to merge into something more powerful. Self-knowledge informed my intelligence gathering. Pattern recognition enhanced my timing decisions. Flexibility supported my indirect approaches. Each element strengthened the others until they operated as an integrated whole rather than a collection of separate tools. This integration didn't happen automatically. It required deliberate practice and conscious effort to connect different aspects of strategic thinking into coherent patterns. I had to learn how to apply multiple techniques simultaneously without becoming overwhelmed by complexity or paralyzed by too many considerations. The foundation of integration was developing. What I called strategic intuition, the ability to rapidly synthesize complex information and generate responses without conscious analysis of each individual component. This wasn't mystical insight, but rather the natural result of extensive practice that had made strategic thinking patterns so familiar they operated below the level of conscious awareness. I learned to trust this integrated intuition while maintaining the ability to analyze its recommendations when circumstances permitted deeper reflection. In rapid decision situations, my synthesized strategic sense could generate effective responses immediately. In less urgent circumstances, I could examine these intuitive responses analytically to refine them further. The integration process also required understanding how different strategic principles applied in different contexts, and learning to emphasize the most relevant approaches for each unique situation. Self-knowledge was always important, but its specific applications varied depending on whether I was negotiating alliances, planning campaigns, or managing resources. I developed daily practices that reinforced this integration by regularly exercising multiple strategic thinking capabilities simultaneously. Instead of practicing pattern recognition in isolation, I would combine it with timing, analysis, and opponent assessment. Instead of developing flexibility separately, I would integrate it with long-term planning and resource management. Perhaps, most importantly, I learned that mastery required moving beyond mechanical application of techniques toward genuine understanding of the underlying principles that made these approaches effective. This deeper comprehension allowed me to adapt methods to new situations rather than rigidly applying predetermined formulas. The integrated strategist develops what I called situational fluency, the ability to read complex situations quickly and select appropriate combinations of strategic approaches without lengthy deliberation. Like a master musician who can improvise within multiple musical styles simultaneously, the strategic master can blend different thinking approaches fluidly as circumstances require. This integration also meant understanding the meta principles that governed when to emphasize different aspects of strategic thinking. When facing deceptive opponents, psychological analysis became paramount. When operating under severe time pressure, rapid assessment skills were crucial. When pursuing long-term objectives, patient positioning took precedence. I learned that true strategic integration required emotional as well as intellectual synthesis. The various strategic approaches had to become natural expressions of my personality rather than artificial techniques imposed on my thinking. This emotional integration prevented internal conflicts between different strategic impulses and allowed all my capabilities to work in harmony. The master's integration ultimately transforms strategic thinking from a conscious skill into an unconscious competence that operates continuously rather than only during formal planning sessions. The integrated strategist sees opportunities and threats automatically, positions themselves advantageously without deliberate effort, and responds to challenges with appropriate strategies that emerge naturally from their synthesized understanding. This level of integration represents the goal toward which all strategic thinking development should aim, not just the ability to think strategically when required, but the capacity to live strategically as a natural expression of who you have become through disciplined practice and conscious development. In modern applications, this integrated approach allows you to navigate complex, personal, and professional challenges with a level of strategic sophistication that appears effortless to others, but represents the culmination of systematic development across all dimensions of strategic thinking capability. The ultimate measure of strategic thinking mastery is not what you achieve for yourself, but what you enable others to achieve through the wisdom you pass forward and the example you set through your own transformed approach to every challenge you face. This is why I prepared my succession stone, not just as a symbol of what I had learned, but as a foundation upon which future strategic thinkers could build even greater understanding and capability. As I reflect on this journey we have taken together through the landscape of strategic thinking, I want you to understand that everything I have shared represents not an ending, but a beginning. These principles that guided me through ancient battlefields are now yours to adapt, refine, and apply to the unique challenges of your own time and circumstances. The commitment required for strategic thinking mastery extends far beyond learning techniques or memorizing principles. It demands the courage to see yourself and your world with complete honesty, the discipline to think systematically when others react emotionally, and the wisdom to apply these capabilities in service of objectives that extend beyond immediate self-interest. You now possess the framework for developing strategic thinking capabilities that can transform every aspect of your life. But possession of knowledge is not the same as mastery of application. The principles I have shared will only become powerful in your life through consistent practice, thoughtful adaptation, and patient development over time. I encourage you to begin immediately, but begin small. Choose one area of your life where strategic thinking could make a meaningful difference. Perhaps a workplace challenge, a personal relationship, or a long-term goal you have been pursuing. Apply the principles systematically to this single situation until they become natural and effective. Then gradually expand their application to other areas. Remember that strategic thinking development is itself a long-term strategy that requires the same patience and persistence that characterizes effective strategy in any domain. You will not master these approaches overnight, but consistent application will gradually transform your capacity to navigate complex situations and achieve objectives that once seemed impossible. Your strategic thinking legacy will ultimately be measured not by the victories you achieve, but by the wisdom you develop, the example you set, and the positive influence you have on others who observe your transformed approach to challenges and opportunities. Every person who learns to think strategically contributes to a world where conflicts can be resolved more intelligently, resources can be used more efficiently, and human potential can be developed more fully. I challenge you to carry forward what I have taught, but more importantly, to continue developing these capabilities beyond what I have shared. The strategic thinking principles that guided ancient warfare can be refined and extended to address modern challenges that I could never have imagined. Your generation has the opportunity to take strategic thinking to levels of sophistication, an application that surpass anything achieved in my time. The responsibility that comes with strategic thinking knowledge is significant. These capabilities can be used to manipulate and exploit others, or they can be used to create value, solve problems, and help people achieve their highest potential. I trust that you will choose the path of wisdom rather than mere cleverness, of service rather than selfishness, of long-term thinking rather than short-term advantage. Your strategic thinking journey begins now. In this moment, with the first decision you make after absorbing these principles, that decision will reveal whether you have truly understood not just the techniques of strategic thinking, but its deeper purpose to enable human flourishing through more intelligent and compassionate responses to the challenges we all face. The battlefield has changed, but the need for strategic thinking wisdom remains as crucial as ever. Take what I have given you, make it your own, and build upon it something even greater for those who will follow in your footsteps.